All right, I'm sure some people will be trickling in, but let's go ahead and get started. Got a lot of material to cover, and yeah, let's jump right in. So we're going to talk today about Chapter 7 and a little bit about Chapter 8. Chapter 7 has to do with economic growth, right? It's kind of the main reason why macroeconomics exists, why economics exists, actually, writ large, right? Economics, the origin of economics, the term actually comes from Aristotle, who, was big into philosophy and writing, right? One of the grandfathers of philosophy. And he actually talked about the separation of activities pertaining to trade. And he talked specifically about the separation to o economica and cremestike, right? Whereas o economica is the general trading of goods in between households or just in markets, while cremestike is more of the macroeconomic concept that we are talking about now, which is trading between countries and growth of countries over time, right? And I mean, really, it wasn't that much about growth, because as we find in chapter 7.1, we've really only seen rapid economic growth from 1870 to now. Rapid and sustained economic growth is a relatively recent experience, relatively new phenomenon. Before the last 2 centuries, right? So from, let's say, 1500 to 1870, sure, there were changes in people's standard of living, but the changes in the standard of living were, mild, right? So what is to cause, right? What is to blame? What is to celebrate for this recent arrival of economic growth? And that would be something we all studied in history class, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution specifically is talking about a widespread use of power-driven machines. And this, in addition to some economic and social changes. Now, here's an interesting question that many economic historians and historians of economic thought, have discussed and thought about. Is it the fact that the technological advances are these which drove the economic and social changes, or did they kind of happen at the same time, right? Or maybe they drove each other. Maybe they reinforced each other. So, a person who takes a more historical approach would probably say that, it really had to do with these power-driven machines and the new machines, which then drove economic and social change. But it's kind of one of those things where it's difficult to separate. Correlation does not equate causation and all that. And so we do our best with the historical data and sources that we have. Now, one of the things that we do know about this Industrial Revolution is that it led to an increasing inequality. Among nations. What do I mean when I say inequality compared to inequity? So we talked a little bit about average GDP, and the flaw with that was that it was assuming that everybody makes $55,000 a year, right? If that's the average GDP. But what we do know is we know that there's a lot of inequality in the United States, right? We know that some people make, $3 million or $40 million. We know some people make $20,000. We know some people make $150,000, right? That's inequality within the country. But this specifically is talking about inequality among nations. So this is talking about, the fact that the nations that led the Industrial Revolution started to make more and more money, and these nations that maybe were left behind in the Industrial Revolution, maybe they were colonies at the time, maybe through a bunch of geographic or political or economic reasons, they had high corruption or they had difficulty with trade. But for whatever reasons, this was the start of the inequality between nations emerging. And we can see this in a couple of interesting statistics, right? So in 1870, the GDP of the top 5 world economies was 2.4 times the GDP of the world's poorest economies. If we fast forward to 1960, we find that the GDP of the top 5 economies now has a 4.2 times to the GDP of the poorest economies. So when economists look at not just the technological changes, right, which is our Industrial Revolution, but the political and economic changes, we can kind of narrow it down to a few standard ingredients necessary for us to have long-run economic growth, right? So what are some of those ingredients, right? So we're going to talk specifically right now about rule of law. And then we'll talk about property rights or contractual rights. So rule of law is about, do you have laws that are clear? They must be clear, can't be convoluted, can't be opaque, can't be difficult to interpret, right? We have some of that going on in the United States, especially with our white-collar law. They must be public, can't be secret. Has to be explicit, right? Has to be fair. Can't have an unfair set of laws. These laws, this is an important part, have to be enforced. It's all well and good to have those laws on the books, but if no one is enforcing them, then might as well not exist. And lastly, and this is kind of included in fair, but we're going to put it as a condition all of its own, and applicable to members of all society. So this one is interesting, especially when we start to look at, even just the United States and how we deal with fines, right? I don't exactly remember who it is. I think it was a comedian, actually. But they talked about how, we don't live in an equal society, right? And the laws are very, symptomatic of that. If the punishment for doing something is a monetary fine, then essentially that's only a crime to people that can't afford the fine. So is that applicable to all members of society when we're fining people, or, if we want to talk, another level, corporations, right? Rather than actually, taking some enforcement action and maybe some rectification, maybe some reschooling or whatever the case may be, right? So the process of enacting these laws has to be fair, and the purpose of this is to protect individual and entity rights. And when we talk about entities, what are we talking about? We're talking about, corporations, right? So the second part that we have here is a protection of our contractual rights. So this was an issue in India maybe 10, 15 years ago. They had these laws that were clear, public, fair, enforced, applicable to members of society, but it took years and years and years in order to get anything actually enforced, right? So the protection of contractual rights. So when we talk about what are contractual rights, well, contractual rights are the rights of individuals to enter agreements with others regarding the use of property. I mean, if we're going to, go foundational, property rights is also one of the very important ones, right? We need property rights before we can have contractual rights. And the tricky part of protection of contractual rights is the steady and timely provisioning of recourse. So the ability to actually enforce the contract, or you get something as a result, right? So maybe you don't get what you want, but you get a compromise, right, through the legal system. In the event of non-compliance.